Record.
All right, good morning, folks on Zoom. Oh, I'm still connecting to audio. There we go. Good morning, folks on Zoom. So I was just chatting with the people who are here in person about things I could fix for the next exam so it doesn't take you all as long. And what they're suggesting is maybe the short answers were too meaty. There weren't as many that were quick one-off, like one-word answers. So that's definitely something I can look at. But I was wondering if there were other things people ran into that made this one take longer, just because I want to fix it before exam 4, so y'all don't have this problem again. So feel free to unmute or throw in the comments anything that made this exam feel different from the last one. And while you're doing that, I'm just going to pull up our lecture for today. I think everyone might also be just sort of like brain dead right now. That could contribute to everything. Alrighty, and folks who are on Zoom, if you think of something as we're going through that I could have, done to make the exam more efficient, just let me know. Because again, you do have one more exam coming up, and I don't want to do that to you again, basically. So, I felt bad. I was like, I don't understand, but that makes sense. The part about the short answers being meatier. Okay, so just to sort of like get us all on the same page. We are going to talk for the next few days about understanding social behavior. We'll have some group assignments, probably Monday when there's more people here. And then we'll talk about everyday living. Then we get Thanksgiving. Woohoo! And then we will do reflections on thinking like a scientist. So this one, instead of 4 perusals, will only be 3. So maybe that'll help too in terms of studying the amount of material as well. Do try to get yourself into the perusals. I know like it's hard at the end of the semester. Certainly, if you've done all of them to this point, you should look at the number required versus the number you've done and see if you can give yourself a little break. But you should still do the reading, obviously, because that'll help you in the long run. But if you have a bunch missing, you can also sort of do these and then look back to see which ones you may not need to make up as a result. So I am just going ahead and checking in folks who are online to give y'all credit. And Julia, is Brecken with you? You can either unmute or.
Yes, she is.
I figured.
Yeah.
Good luck on your game, by the way.
Thank you.
They are traveling to the next stage since they are ODAC champions. I know, pretty badass. Alrighty. Casey. Okay, awesome. Well, thank you all who have signed on. Thank you to those of you who are able to be here in person. And I will certainly, as I grade, I haven't looked at them yet because a couple of people are taking makeups and I like to try to do them all at once if I can. As I grade, I will be mindful of the fact that I might need to add some extra points because of my unreasonable demands on this past exam. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and put us in, well, you know what? Help if I share screen for our Zoom folks first. Alrighty. I'm going to go ahead and put us in presentation mode and throw on the captions. And we'll start working through this. So for those of you who haven't had a chance to look at the perusal for this section, essentially it's sort of double-barreled. So you have a chapter, and then you have some readings about fake news, and why fake news spreads, how fake news spreads, things along those lines. So the lecture at this point mostly focuses on the chapter portion of it, which is a lot of social psych theory. And then there will be an activity later we do related to the fake news portion and you know, maybe some follow-up coverage to that as well. So just to sort of give you all an idea of where I'm going with this one. All righty. So the first thing they talk about in your book is attribution theory. And actually, real quick, I just remembered I actually made us a Kahoot for today. So I want to get that pulled up while I'm chatting here. And we might do that before we do anything else. And those of you who are not just on your phone should be able to follow along. Those of you who are on Zoom and just on your phone, it might be harder to do so. So those of you who have done the perusal meetings, perusal readings, will kind of have seen this already because it's certainly in these questions are from the chapter, but for those of you who haven't, it'll be, and even if you have and you didn't answer them for yourself, it'll be kind of fun. So if you haven't played Kahoot before, you can use your smartphone or your computer. There's a smartphone app, or you can just go to kahoot.it. And then you put in this game pin. And this one will be really quick. Just because of the limitations of Kahoot, it's going to come up like a quiz, but all the answers are right because it's Likert Skills. So again, if you're at home, feel free to sign in on your computer. We got a couple people signing in. Awesome. And those of you in the class as well, we'll give it a few more minutes here. And then again, those of you who are watching on your phone, that's probably way too much to manage. So you can just sort of hang out and watch what we're talking about here. I'll give it just another minute or so for people who do want to get on to join us. And if you haven't done a Kahoot before, I'm guessing a lot of you have, but if you haven't, it's basically just a fun, interactive quiz type platform. And as we go through, it will, there we go. Sorry, the Kahoot music drives me bonkers. As we go through, it will show how people are sort of answering, voting, what have you. Alrighty, so our game pin for those of you who are on is 2591414. I like that someone joined us, just young man. Nice, appreciate that. And it doesn't associate your answers with your name, so please, as we go through this, just be completely honest. Yeah, and if it's not working, you can just sort of like chill. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it should say something like, I have a code or something like that. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and start. The code will still be displayed, I think. If not, I can re-grab it. Okay. So first question, and these are questions about me. And again, I'm not going to judge you one way or the other. And I just put in random pictures for fun. So you're gonna rate me on a set of 5 questions, and you're gonna rate yourself on a set of 5 questions. So just knowing what you know about me, having been through the semester. All right, so some people say I'm self-controlled, some people say I'm uninhibited, some people say it depends on the situation. I'm gonna guess a lot of them will look like this, just because y'all only know me through this classroom. All right, it's gonna give us scores. These are really just gonna be based on who answers the fastest, so I don't care as much as I would if it was like something knowledge-based. So, but just sort of, there's a method to my madness. So the next one is whether I'm quiet or talkative, or depends on the situation. This giraffe might be able to tell you. All righty, so people think I'm talkative, probably because I spend most of class talking at you, right? Makes sense, okay. Choose the term that best describes me again here, lenient, firm, or depends on the situation. This is my actual headshot, by the way, very exciting. Yeah, I would like to say that I'm more lenient, but at least than I used to be in the past. Okay. And am I subjective, analytic, or depends on the situation? This is me presenting at a conference. Very exciting. All right, so you all said depends on the situation. I would probably agree. All righty, one more about me. Am I dignified, casual, or depends on the situation? I did not write these questions. I'm not necessarily the prettiest. I think you can be both dignified and casual. And of course, the fact I'm wearing jeans might influence your answer today, right? Alrighty, so the next questions would be about you. So, are you intense, calm, or depends on the situation? And for these, I just literally put in random pictures. So, my favorite Zoom call ever. If you all remember, this was a lawyer who came on with this cat filter, and nice. Nice. So yeah, people sort of have varying opinions. Most people in this particular question said depends on the situation. So again, choosing terms that describe you. And assuming, oh, that's supposed to be self-asserting. I don't know what self-asserting is. Alrighty, and again, some saying one, some saying the other. A lot of people saying depends on the situation. In this case, are you serious, lighthearted, or depends on the situation? Okay, people generally went right for lighthearted. Nice, I appreciate that. That's why you guys actually laugh at my jokes sometimes. It's the worst when you make a joke as a professor and no one laughs. All right, are you reserved, emotional, or depends on the situation? All right, so a lot of people saying reserved, some people saying depends on the situation, some saying emotional. Again, I don't feel like those are mutually exclusive, so these are not my favorite questions. And last one. Thought you need to see Simba in a cake. You're skeptical, trusting, or depends on the situation. All right, so you will actually, yeah, we don't actually need to see the podium because it's really just too quick to pass this. You will actually did this a little differently than they think you would. So what the book suggests is that typically you're describing other people, you tend to say things are attributionally based. You'll tend to just choose one of those descriptors more often. And then when you describe yourself, you're much more likely to say it depends on the situation. And we're going to watch a couple of videos and talk about why that is as we go through this. But you will, I think, probably because you're psychologically minded people, right, kind of did a mix of both for both yourself and for me. So.
If there's one thing that I've learned from studying psychology, it's that people are fascinated by it. All of us want to know if there's one thing.
Oh, sorry, guys. It's like very strangely placed. There we go.
If there's one thing that I've learned from studying psychology, it's that people are fascinated by it. All of us want to know a little bit more about why people do the things that they do. We want to be able to explain the behaviors of our friends, our families, partners, and colleagues, and even strangers. In fact, we already try to explain human behavior without even thinking that we're doing so. Have you ever tried to analyze the behavior of the guy that your friend is dating? Or maybe you saw someone running in public and thought, he must be running from the police. Maybe your colleague is acting strange and you think, they're hiding something from me. Humans are meaning-making creatures, and while psychologists attempt to understand and explain behavior, they're also attempting to understand how humans attempt to understand and explain behavior. This process is called attribution. The ways that people explain behavior and the mistakes that they do while making so, because there are plenty of mistakes we make, it might just be as insightful as the actual explanations for the behavior. So I want to talk a little bit about something called attribution theory. So attribution was first brought into the world of psychology in the earliest 20th century by Gestalt psychologist Fritz Heider. Although he did not dive too deep into the process of attribution, he did define two different types of attribution that are still commonly discussed in attribution theory today: dispositional and situational attribution. So, dispositional attribution, or internal attribution, occurs when you believe that a person's behavior is driven by internal factors. For example, a person may cry on the subway because they're emotionally unstable, or maybe because they cry easily. Either way, it's due to that person's internal factors. Secondly, we have situational attribution, also called external attribution, and it occurs when you believe a person's behavior is driven by external factors. Maybe you see the same person crying on the same subway, but you assume that their behavior might be due to an external situation. Maybe they saw something traumatic, or they just got broken up with by the person sitting next to them on the subway. Either process could give you the correct answer, but attribution focuses more on how people come to these conclusions. For example, theories on actor-observer bias suggest that we are more likely to use internal or external attribution depending on whether we are the person performing the behavior or whether we are the person observing it. Next, I want to talk about something called correspondent inference theory. Some attributions theory focus specifically on dispositional attribution. Take, for example, Jones and Davis's correspondent inference theory. Jones and Davis believe that we are more likely to use internal attribution under specific circumstances. If a person acted freely and intentionally, we may be more likely to attribute their actions to their character. We say that it's just the type of person they are. Other factors may lead us to also make internal attributions, and those include if the behavior is particularly unusual, if the behavior is directed at a person, or if the behavior may directly harm or help another person. So let's say you're walking down the street and you hear someone harassing you. It's not a usual behavior and it is directed at you. It checks off 2 of these off the list. You believe that the street harassment is done to negatively get a reaction out of people. You are more likely to attribute that behavior to the harasser's character rather than some external stimuli that is driving their behavior. In short, this theory helps you understand if we say that a person is doing something because of who they are or because of the situation they're in. Next, I want to talk about Kelly's covariation model. Because attribution theory does not stop with just something called the correspondent inference theory. In 1973, Harold Kelly created a model that is arguably one of the most well-known attribution theories. Kelly's covariation model suggests that there are 3 factors to determine if we use internal or external attribution. So let's say you're at a dinner party and your friend orders a very expensive champagne during a night out with some of your other friends. Now, you may be wondering, is this because they prefer the finer things in life? Or is it because of external factors in the situation that they are in are motivating them to do so? Kelly has 3 specific factors that you can use to figure out the answer. The first one is consensus. So consensus is how everyone else is behaving in the same situation. You may look at what everyone else is ordering. If everyone in the table is ordering expensive drinks and caviar, then consensus is high. However, if everyone's sticking to cheap appetizers and cheap beer, consensus is low. Secondly, we have distinctiveness. Now this is how your friend behaves in similar situations. Let's say your friend always orders the fanciest item on the menus or buys the most expensive clothes in the mall. If they do, distinctiveness is low, but if they like to save their money, buy from thrift stores, or choose restaurants with cheaper prices, then distinctiveness is high. We're basically saying that your friend buying a very expensive bottle of champagne is distinct. And third, we have consistency, and this is how your friend behaves every time in this situation. Maybe your friend always likes to buy expensive champagne whenever you're out with this particular friend group, or maybe this specific restaurant. And if so, consistency is high. But if this is the first time your friend has chosen to buy really expensive drinks for your friends, we then say consistency is low. And if you find that your friend's behavior is on the low side of the spectrum, on all 3 of these, you're more likely to attribute that behavior to your friend's personality. You say that's just who they are. They're just a flashy guy that values the finer things in life. But if your friend's behavior is on the high side of the spectrum, you're more likely to attribute that to external stimuli. Maybe your friend feels as though they made a bad impression when they first met those friends and they want to make up for it. Or maybe they got a raise. Or maybe even they were hurt by some bad news and they just want to make the evening special. Of course, we can't always use this model with strangers, as with anything in psychology. If a stranger orders very expensive champagne, you can't just look at every single purchase they've made, or exactly who they're with. And in this case, Kelly suggests to look past experiences and attribute necessary and sufficient causes to the person's behavior. People do this all the time. You might just look at a stranger's fancy suit and assume that he's just a high roller. Again, these attributions and what we understand of attribution theory doesn't always reflect the true motives behind a person's behavior. But as I end this video, I want to let you know if we can understand theories of attribution, we may understand how people judge other people, and we may be able to refine the way that we assign causes and make our beliefs and judgments about certain behaviors. So as a review, we went over a little bit about the history of
Okay, so that gives you a nice overview of attribution theory and actually gets into a little more nuance than your book does, which is nice.
If there's one thing that I've learned from
All right, so it's basically the social psychological study of the way people explain behavior. And I called an audible this morning and moved the Kahoot just because I thought it was best to do it first. But essentially, we often think of things other people do, particularly strangers, right? People we don't know that well, as due to their personality, right? There's something inherent about them that is making them act this way. Whereas we tend to attribute our own things, behaviors, to the situation. That we know our own history better, right? So we know that, like, I wouldn't necessarily act like this in every given situation. So again, you all, I think, being much more psychologically minded, didn't necessarily follow the pattern we typically see. But typically, you would have rated me more on these attributes and yourself more on depends on the situation. All right, so maybe not surprisingly, this gets us back to that fundamental attribution error that we've mentioned before, and that again, you've probably learned about in, say, IntroPsych. And essentially, my best example for this is usually that, let's say you see someone like trip on the sidewalk when you're walking over to the library. And you're like, oof, that person's really clumsy, right? But then you, the next day, trip on the same part of the sidewalk, and you're like, who put that cat there, right? So it's like you attribute it to the situation. And obviously, that's a little bit less harmful than when you take this to the extreme and you assume that because of someone's race or class or gender, right, or other things, like they were saying, their clothing, certain things are true about them, right? But like that won't affect me because I'm an individual. So that's really important to keep in mind, is that the fundamental attribution error can end up being quite harmful and toxic if we are making assumptions based on those quick things we see about another person, and those are tied to prejudice and stereotypes. So as the video said, dispositional or internal attributions are explanations for behavior based on internal individual characteristics like personality traits or attitudes. Situational or external attributions are when you explain behavior based on aspects of an individual's environment or situation. So again, I like their example of someone crying on the train. You could just think, well, this person probably has some mental health issues. Or you could think like, I wonder what's going on. I wonder what just happened to them, right? And depending honestly on a lot of what's going on with you in the moment, right? You may or may not have a capacity for empathy. To be perfectly honest, the pandemic has really worn on that for most of us. And there are studies showing this, right? That it's like really hard. It's hard to be in the moment, be empathetic, think about other people, just in general, when your life feels at risk, right? And for the past 18 months or so, we've been in this constant state of feeling like our lives are at risk, at least to some degree, right? So that decreases our capacity for empathy. And certain other factors also play into that, obviously. So if you are very pro-vax, like I clearly am, based on the shirt I'm wearing today, you might struggle to find empathy for the people who are very anti-vax, right? And some people have gotten so callous that like psychologists, like genuinely good people in other circumstances, are saying things like, well, if they don't want to get the vaccine, they can just die, right? And that's just not a very good attitude to have towards fellow people in general, but very particularly if you're someone who has training in psychology, right? Like that's problematic. There's a lot of burnout among therapists right now, as you can imagine, right? One of the many reasons I let you all keep your cameras off if you're on Zoom is because there's a lot of research starting to come out about Zoom fatigue and it being compounded by having to like stare at your own face, which we don't normally do for as long, right? And also that there are sexist and classist implications of Zoom, for example, of having your camera on, right? Like the assumption that someone will have a distraction-free space of their own to go on Zoom is not an assumption that all people can do, right? You know, if you are, you know, especially during the pandemic when no one was on campus, we had people, you know, living in their household with all their other siblings, perhaps extended family, right? And some people just could not find a private setting. And yet I think a lot of people, including my colleagues, to be honest, misinterpret cameras being off as somehow a sign of disrespect, and don't think about sort of the social psychological implications. One of the reasons I got over here just on time today is our faculty assembly, which is the faculty governance body that we have, just passed a resolution last week saying, okay, you can be remote if you have to, but you have to have your camera on at all times or you're considered absent. And like I gave them a ton of links to the research showing why that's problematic. And then I also pointed out gently that, like, as I said in the meeting last week, probably a half dozen of my colleagues left the room at one point, which they should be able to do, right? When you're in a meeting, particularly one that lasts an hour and a half, right? To probably go use the restroom or like take a phone call, things like that. But we're not affording the same courtesy to our colleagues who will be on Zoom, right? So I wrote them a, there's a lot of citations. I don't know if they're going to know what to do with it, but to the committee that runs faculty assembly, none of them are social scientists, so I don't know what they're going to do. So people are more likely to use these dispositional attributions for others other than themselves, right? Like if someone doesn't have their camera on Zoom, that means they're being disrespectful or they're not there, is an example that I've heard other people say. And clearly I don't think that way, right? I know that you all are there. I've had you all participate in groups when you're on Zoom, right? You type in the chat, you unmute yourselves, and you know, we have that great trust and community, I think, because I've really worked to build that in my courses. You know, and again, I hate to just like blanketly criticize because then I'm making dispositional attributions, right? But just, you know, my colleagues not understanding that is frustrating because I think they're typically more empathetic people. And again, recognizing that it's a struggle for them as well right now. Educators, therapists, doctors, nurses have the highest rates of burnout right now, also frontline workers. So the really interesting thing is that this is also slightly cultural. So this is true in Western cultures like the US, which tend to be more individualistic, which means that not, you know, in a bad way. I think some people will take this and be like, oh, narcissism, but no, just like our culture tends to focus on the individual pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, and you succeed or fail based on your own work ethic, right? And that's not as true in some of the Eastern cultures like China or Japan, where there tends to be more of what's called a collectivistic model, where you tend to think more about the group, whether that's your family or whether that's your work colleagues, classmates, what have you, that they're much more likely to sort of think the attributions are like applicable to everybody in the same way, because they're kind of thinking of themselves as being on the same page, if that makes sense. Let me not trip over that cord. So again, it's just a different way of looking at things. And like one of the things I talk about in my theories of personality class, which I know a couple of you were in last year, is the fact that just like English has more words for personality traits than some of the language in these places that have collectivist cultures. And oftentimes, like the number of words we have for something is somewhat an indicator of how important it is to us, right? Now, really interestingly, that distinction between Western, Eastern, individualistic, collectivistic, disappears when the attribution towards the other person is negative. In that case, pretty much everybody assumes it's something wrong with that person. Okay, like, and you can see how even in collectivistic cultures, this might even be higher, because like that person is now negatively reflecting on everybody, right, as opposed to just themselves. But yeah, if someone's doing something horrible, as I said in the video, harassing someone, I don't know, murdering someone, right, the extremes, we don't go like, oh, it was the situation that made them murder the person, right? And there are a few exceptions, right? Obviously, like wartime, domestic abuse, things like that. But typically, we tend to think like that was that person's choice that they made, right? Or right or wrong. All right, I have a video. It's acted out by students, so heads up, they're not theater students, so it's not the best acting ever, but it's a couple fun little scenarios illustrating the fundamental attribution error. So, but just a little bit different way of looking at things than what we usually do.
What? Hey, what's up? Do you know what just happened?
No, what happened?
Ellie just ran and she bumped into me. She didn't even turn back to say sorry.
Oh my god, what's wrong with her?
I know, right? She's so inconsiderate and rude.
I totally agree.
I'm never gonna talk to her again.
Oh my gosh, oh my gosh.
What?
Did I bump into someone just now? Oh, whatever, my class is already starting.
Hey Lucy, do you want to come to a party?
Oh.
Okay. Hey! Yeah, I did ask her. And she said no again. I know, right? She's so antisocial and she seems pretty lazy. All she does is just lie there. Yeah, I don't think we can ever be friends. Hey, what's up?
Hi, Catherine.
Hi Lynn, how are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm good.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure, of course.
What's up mean?
Oh, it just means hi or how are you doing?
Oh, well, thank you.
Yeah, anytime.
Hi, Anna. You don't play cards with us?
I would love to, but I'm going to volunteer.
Oh, okay. Maybe
Another
next time.
Okay. Bye guys.
Bye.
Thanks. She's such a sweet human being.
She really is.
She's so selfless.
So
going to
kind.
volunteer all the time.
Yeah.
She's so great.
So great.
Love her.
Me too.
Finally done volunteering. Okay, let's see.
that was 3 hours of community service. But I still have 7 more to go. Why did I sign up for this program that makes me do community service?
So again, not the best acting, right? But cut them some slack because they're clearly college students. But some nice examples there, both positive and negative attributions we can make about people that might not be accurate because of that, right? They went a different direction with the community service than I thought they were. I thought they were gonna be like, she had to do it because she got in trouble. So that was kind of them. But yeah, thinking about things like, being not saying hi back, maybe not knowing what what's up means because of cultural issues. Maybe, other things going on and that's how you knocked into somebody. I was like having a little bit of like memory of when I was a first year in college and I had that happen on a day I had a quiz, just like staring down the middle of campus. I'm sure people were like, who is this crazy person running through campus? Because we were a pretty casual campus. People just kind of strolled usually. So, but yeah, so there are different ways, different reasons. Interestingly, the scenario of like talking to someone and they don't say hi is one we typically use in therapy as an example of people of how like our interpretations of a situation actually affect us more than the actual situation, right? So like if you go through that scenario and you're like, oh, that person's rude and mean, or you're like, why did that person not say hi? Is there something wrong with me? Is like, do I have something in my teeth, right? Is my hair out of place? Or am I just a horrible person? That's extreme, but someone who's depressed, for example, might think that way. When in fact, if you, realize maybe they didn't hear me, see me, maybe there's something going on with them, right? Then it totally changes how not only you interpret that situation, but the consequences that interpretation has on how you're particularly feeling and thinking about yourself and the other person. Alrighty. Okay, so your book loves these really long anecdotes. So I just copy pasted them. But basically, when we know these things, when we've learned these things, we might be able to overcome these biases and be more accurate about not only our interpretations of our own behavior, but those of other people. That being said, this is really hard to shake, right? So if you find yourself still doing this, don't beat yourself up, right? This is a pretty natural thing to do. So this is an example of this, right? So they told research participants in a particular study that these people who wrote these controversial political views had instructions to do that, to take that position. Like if anyone ever did like debates, right? Sometimes you have to argue against your actual opinion. And that's what they were arguing was happening here. But people, even knowing that, said, that is on the writer, not the situation. But we will use that situational information if it's salient, like if it's more noticeable. So we see someone crying by the side of the road just by themselves, we might be like, what's wrong with that person? But if we see someone crying by the side of the road and they've just been in a horrible car accident and you can still see the wreckage, right? The situation is going to be much more evident and we're going to focus on that a lot more. So the adjustment in thinking about the role of situations requires us to make an effort because again, we as people like to use traits, like to use ways to like classify people just because they're quick, they're easy for us. They help us do things more efficiently. Examples that I can think of right now, this one where they're talking about criminal confessions, right? The way we perceive court cases, right? So we've got 2 different court cases going on in the country right now. The case of the man who was shot while just running in Georgia, And then the case of the guy who decided to make himself a vigilante in Minnesota, Wisconsin, one of the two, right? And like in both cases, we are seeing bias, right? And because we are intelligent people with, again, psychological background and understanding about all of the racial and social issues in the United States, right? We can recognize that. A lot of people aren't, unfortunately. And it's because of this partially. So knowing about the origins of behavior can help our psychological literacy. And in this, I mean, I guess if you're going to be a social psychologist, or I think like this could help with that. But really, this is going to help more in your day-to-day life, right? Interacting with people, things along those lines. So trying to put ourselves in other people's shoes is something called perspective taking. It can be really hard to do that, but it can be really important to do that. This is even harder for people from certain populations. So this is called theory of mind. It's the ability to essentially put yourself into someone else's mind the best you can. And for example, people with schizophrenia struggle to do this. People on the autism spectrum struggle to do this sometimes. So we also need to recognize that there might be, you know, things that seem like traits but are actually situational, right? Like you can't really help if you have one of these disorders, right? And be a piece of that. All right, so let's end there for today. And we will continue on with the other types of bias on Monday. I'll hang around for a couple minutes in case anyone has questions. And if not, have a great weekend. And I have exam 2. I think everybody else in here already got your respect. Yep. Alrighty, have a great weekend, guys.